Let's break it down straight from the hill to your hometown. No spin, no hype, just facts we find. AI's on the case, no truth left behind. Laws are written, deals are made. Who's got your back, who's throwing shade? We cut through the noise, decode the text, keeping it real. Congress in context, Congress in context, shining the light, breaking it down so you know what's right. Policies, votes, who's working for you? We bring the facts, the power is you.
Welcome to Congress in Context. We're diving deep today into the Congressional Record from May 12th, 2025.
That's right. You sent this over wanting to get a clearer picture of what's actually happening on the ground in Congress.
Exactly. So that's our mission. Cut through the formal language, highlight the key debates, the bills, the decisions that are shaping policy right now.
Yeah, look at the legislative action, those significant tributes, and maybe importantly, where the friction points are.
Right. It's really a snapshot of Congress in action on one particular day.
And, looking at just one day's record, it really gives you a microcosm of everything, doesn't it? All the different threads, the tensions, the work happening all at once.
Okay, let's unpack it. So the session kicked off, as usual, prayer, Pledge of Allegiance.
Standard procedure.
But then things quickly moved to acknowledging some important events and people. Mr. Budd stood up. It was National Police Week.
Ah, yeah.
And he specifically honored two officers from Iowa who had fallen, Trooper Jeffrey Brown and Senior Police Officer Falcom Tran.
It's always sobering to hear those tributes. A reminder.
Definitely. And the number he mentioned, 234 officers being honored this year nationally, that really hits home.
It does. And these moments, they're a formal part of the proceedings, but they matter. They recognize public service, loss. Mentioning specific officers, like Mr. Budd did, makes that national recognition feel very local, very real.
Then Mr. Thune spoke. He acknowledged the passing of Supreme Court Justice David Souter. Big news there.
Huge implications, legally and politically, when a justice passes.
And he also congratulated Cardinal Robert Prevost on becoming Pope Leo XIV.
Right, another significant event, but on a global religious scale.
And Mr. Thune pointed out something interesting. Cardinal Prevost is the first American-born pope.
Which is, quite a milestone, particularly for American Catholics. It shows the Senate acknowledging these major national and international moments.
Okay, so turning to the actual legislative stuff. Mr. Thune made a motion to proceed on S-1582. That's the Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for U.S. Stablecoins Act.
Right, the Stablecoins Act.
For anyone listening who isn't, deep in the crypto world, maybe just briefly, what is a stablecoin and why is Congress looking at regulating them?
Sure. So basically, a stablecoin is a type of cryptocurrency, but it's designed to hold a steady value. Usually it's pegged to something stable, like the U.S. dollar.
Okay, so not the wild swings you see with Bitcoin sometimes.
Exactly. The idea is you get the benefits of crypto, like fast transactions, but without that volatility. Congress is stepping in because, well, there are risks. Consumer protection, financial stability, preventing illicit use, that kind of thing.
So trying to bring some order to this new financial technology?
Pretty much. It shows Congress trying to get a handle on this evolving digital finance space.
Got it. But it sounds like not everything was moving forward smoothly. Mr. Thune also expressed some serious frustration about another bill, the Genius Act.
Ah, yes. He seemed quite upset.
He said Democrats had, quote, abruptly ended extensive bipartisan work and were filibustering it, even though it apparently had support in committee before. So what's the deal there? Was it really about the details of the bill, or was it more, political strategy, like denying the other side a win?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It really highlights the partisan dynamics. From Mr. Thune's perspective, it was pure obstruction.
He framed it as stopping a Republican or Trump victory.
Exactly. Whether the objections were truly about the bill's substance or just strategic maneuvering, well, that's often hard to tell from the outside. But it definitely shows how easily things can get bogged down in gridlock. Policy versus politics.
And that tension seems to spill over into nominations too, doesn't it? Mr. Thune was also critical about the pace of confirming President Trump's civilian nominees.
Very critical. He flagged some striking numbers.
Yeah, he said 57 out of 58 nominees needed cloture votes to move forward. That's the vote to end debate, right? Needs a supermajority.
Correct. 60 votes needed. And needing it that often for almost every nominee is highly unusual. It points to a concerted effort to slow things down.
But here's the interesting part. He also mentioned that 17 of those nominees eventually got 60 or more votes anyway.
Which does suggest, a fair amount of bipartisan support eventually. It makes the initial obstruction look even more procedural or strategic, perhaps.
And he said no civilian nominee had been confirmed by unanimous consent or voice vote, which he called entirely unprecedented since at least 77, except maybe during Trump's first term.
Yeah, that really paints a picture of a deeply polarized Senate, a significant shift from historical norms for confirmations.
Okay, let's shift gears completely now. There was a major policy clash discussed centering on Medicaid and tax cuts. The record includes a Democratic perspective raising some serious alarms.
Right. Big concerns about potential Republican plans to change how Medicaid is funded.
They painted a pretty bleak picture, especially for hospitals in Illinois, rural ones, safety net hospitals, big teaching hospitals, talking about potential closures, losing essential services, like baby deliveries even.
It really highlights the different philosophies on the government's role in healthcare, doesn't it? The Democrats are focusing hard on the potential human cost, the impact on vulnerable people, and the healthcare system itself.
And they directly linked these potential Medicaid cuts to tax breaks from the Trump administration, arguing the cuts were basically to pay for tax breaks for the wealthy.
Yeah, that was a central part of their argument. The priority was preserving tax cuts, and social programs like Medicaid were potentially on the chopping block as a result.
They even mentioned Elon Musk, alleging he supported the cuts.
Right, using that name to sort of underscore the idea that it's about benefiting the wealthy, maybe at the expense of others.
And to back this up, they pointed to a Congressional Budget Office report, the CBO. They said it called their bluff, essentially indicating the cuts weren't just about waste or efficiency, but about restricting access to care.
Citing the CBO is significant. They're the nonpartisan scorekeepers. If their analysis contradicts the stated reason for the cuts, that adds weight to the Democratic argument.
And the number they threw out was pretty staggering, potentially 13.7 million Americans losing health insurance.
A huge number. That figure really drives home the high stakes in this debate.
The concerns went beyond Illinois, too. They flagged the general poor health, financially speaking, of rural hospitals across the country.
That's a known issue, unfortunately.
Saying half are already in the red, over 300 facing immediate closure risks. They even gave numbers for Kansas, Alabama, Texas, Missouri.
And Medicaid is often a lifeline for those rural hospitals, so cuts could really hit them hard, impacting healthcare access in those communities dramatically.
They also criticized another approach, imposing what they called burdensome red tape requirements or work requirements for Medicaid.
Right, the idea being you have to work or prove you're looking for work to get benefits.
Their argument was this doesn't actually boost employment much. It just causes people who are eligible to lose coverage because they can't navigate the paperwork. They used an example of a waitress with diabetes.
It's the classic debate. Incentivizing work versus maintaining a safety net. That example really personalizes the argument that bureaucratic hurdles can harm vulnerable people.
And they estimated 3 million workers in sectors like manufacturing, farming, services could lose insurance because of these requirements.
Yeah, hitting working people potentially.
The rhetoric definitely ramped up. Claims that House Republicans pushed these cuts on Mother's Day, calling it the largest cut in Medicaid in the nation's health history.
Using dates like Mother's Day, that's clearly meant to add emotional weight, emphasize the perceived harshness.
And they stressed how vital Medicaid is in a state like Illinois. Covers 1 in 4 people, 1.5 million kids, pays for half the births, supports seniors in nursing homes, addiction treatment.
Painting a broad picture of the program's reach to show just how widespread the impact of cuts could be.
Okay, let's switch focus now to foreign policy. The Russia-Ukraine conflict. The record includes a Republican perspective here.
Right, starting off with a Churchill quote about the Soviet Union.
Setting a historical frame, suggesting Putin's goals are just fundamentally different from the West's, making talks really tough.
That framing that Putin operates on a different wavelength is key to their argument. It implies standard diplomacy might not be enough.
And they praised President Trump's efforts, claiming he did more in his first 100 days than Biden did in 4 years.
Highlighting specific things like getting Europeans to spend more on defense, boosting deterrence.
They also mentioned negotiations led by Trump's team and securing a critical minerals deal with Ukraine as positive steps.
So presenting Trump's approach as more assertive, more effective, and yielding tangible results, contrasting it with the current administration.
But they identified Putin himself as the main obstacle to peace.
Yeah, emphasizing his perceived lack of remorse for Russian losses, his ambition to rebuild an empire.
And pointing out that even after an Easter ceasefire was declared, Russia kept attacking. They included specific incidents, missile strikes, drones, civilian casualties.
Right, using those on-the-ground realities to counter any narrative of Putin seeking resolution.
They even quoted frustrated Kyiv residents and an 18-year-old student, plus a statement from President Trump on Truth Social questioning if Putin even wants to stop the war.
Adding those human elements and Trump's direct comment really personalizes the conflict and reinforces the view of Putin as the main barrier.
They also laid out Putin's stated conditions for peace from an earlier speech: Ukrainian troops out, demilitarization, neutrality, no sanctions. Pretty maximalist demands.
Very tough conditions.
Yeah.
Laying them out shows just how far apart the sides likely are.
And this perspective also suggested Putin sees it as a bigger war, Russia versus the West, blaming the West for stirring things up back in 2014 and again in 2022.
That framing, that it's a proxy war in Putin's eyes, adds another layer of complexity to finding any common ground.
Concerns were raised about trust too, referencing the Budapest Memorandum, questioning if Russia would even honor a future deal. Plus, Putin's nuclear threats.
These are fundamental challenges. Can you trust agreements? How do you deal with nuclear rhetoric? Huge questions.
But despite all that, the assertion was made that Putin won't be able to, quote, dupe or strong-arm President Trump.
A very confident statement about Trump's negotiating stance and ability to handle Putin, reflecting a specific view on his leadership style in foreign policy.
All right, moving into some specific controversies and accusations now. Mr. Schumer started with some positive news, the release of Eden Alexander, an American-Israeli hostage held by Hamas.
Yes, a welcome development in a very difficult situation, and he reiterated the call for all hostages to be released.
Definitely. But then Mr. Schumer turned critical. He brought up reports about the Qatari royal family gifting Donald Trump a luxury 747.
Ah, yes, that story.
He called it shameless self-enrichment and flagged major national security concerns about foreign influence.
Strong words. It raises serious ethical questions, potentially legal ones, under the Constitution's emoluments clause, which is meant to prevent exactly this kind of foreign influence.
He also hit President Trump on trade, specifically a reported pause on tariffs with China. Schumer called it a cave-in with virtually nothing for American workers, pointing to what he sees as unpredictable trade policy.
So, questioning the substance and strategy of Trump's trade approach, arguing it didn't deliver for the U.S.
And on prescription drugs, Trump's new executive order, Schumer dismissed it as just a photo op masquerading as reform.
Contrasting it sharply with legislative actions Democrats took, like the insulin price cap and allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Basically arguing an executive order isn't enough, you need laws.
He then circled back to the Medicaid issue, condemning the Republican plan to, his words, eviscerate Medicaid while cutting taxes for the rich. He listed the potential impacts again: millions losing insurance, hospitals closing, hitting vulnerable groups.
Doubling down on that message, really hammering home the potential negative consequences as they see them.
And he mentioned expected Republican plans to cut SNP, the food assistance program, as well.
Broadening the critique beyond just Medicaid to other safety net programs.
He also defended the Democrats' actions on the stablecoins bill, saying they were right to object to voting on something when they didn't even have the legislative text yet.
A procedural argument, basically saying, hold on, we need to see the bill before we vote, invoking Senate traditions.
And Senator Schatz also chimed in on that Qatari gift issue, echoing the concerns and specifically mentioning the emoluments clause and the need for undivided loyalty from public officials.
Reinforcing the seriousness of those allegations from a constitutional and ethical standpoint.
Okay, let's look at the executive session part of the record. Nominations. They moved to consider Eric Uland for OMB and Sean Donahue for EPA.
Right. Office of Management and Budget and the Environmental Protection Agency. Key posts.
But cloture motions were filed for both, indicating, again, slowdowns and obstruction.
Yeah, the need for cloture, even for these roles, shows that partisan friction is still very high.
However, some did get through. Monica Crowley for Chief of Protocol to Cloture vote succeeded, and she was confirmed.
Okay, so movement there.
Same for Reed Rubenstein to be a legal advisor at the State Department. Cloture agreed to, then confirmation.
So it's not total gridlock on nominations. The majority can still push confirmations through, but it requires navigating these procedural hurdles like cloture votes. Shows the process, even when successful, can be quite laborious.
Now let's get into some really intense policy debates that were recorded. Energy and environment. Wow.
Sounds like things got heated.
Very. A passionate argument was made against the Trump administration's energy policies, specifically aimed at Energy Secretary Chris Wright. Really sharp accusations.
Like what?
Trying to destroy the clean energy future, putting oil and gas profits first, making the U.S. fall behind China in clean tech. Strong stuff.
Okay, so a fundamental clash of visions there. Fossil fuels versus renewables, framed in stark terms.
And they gave specific examples of tax credits supposedly being killed off for solar panels on restaurants, electric delivery trucks, EV battery manufacturing, offshore wind.
Getting specific helps illustrate the argument, showing where they believe the policies are actively harming clean energy growth.
Secretary Wright's stance on offshore wind was criticized, and the claim was made that his real goal is basically to protect natural gas generation.
So suggesting a motive tied to protecting incumbent industries? That's a serious charge.
The speaker argued the U.S. was a leader, but is becoming a laggard now. They pointed to 400,000 clean energy jobs and $400 billion in investment, they say, came from a recent climate bill, likely the Inflation Reduction Act.
So directly challenging the administration's narrative with figures, arguing these policies are reversing progress.
Secretary Wright was even called a fracker-in-chief and accused of false statements about clean energy grants and staffing.
Wow, fracker-in-chief. That's pointed. And question his truthfulness is a direct attack on his credibility.
There were also concerns about a deregulatory blitz, getting rid of efficiency standards for appliances, microwaves, fridges, washers, potentially raising people's electricity bills.
So connecting deregulation not just to environment, but to consumer costs too.
The argument was made that these policies help the old boys network in energy, hurting young people and a clean future. They challenged Wright's past statements comparing gas growth to wind and solar.
How so?
By citing stats that over 90% of new U.S. electricity capacity last year, and 96% globally, was wind, solar, and batteries, basically saying renewables are already winning the race for new capacity.
Using data to counter the narrative that fossil fuels are still the dominant growth engine. That's a powerful counter-argument.
The speaker suggested the motive was basically to stop clean energy's growth before it completely disrupts the fossil fuel business model.
A strategic argument that it's about protecting an established industry from inevitable change.
They refuted claims Wright made about the previous administration's climate policies, stressing the jobs and investments spurred back then.
Defending the prior record to contrast it with the current approach.
And they brought up the human cost of pollution and climate change, asthma deaths, extreme weather damage, calling that the real disease, and rollbacks harmful.
Framing environmental protection as a public health issue.
Right. And the administration were accused of prioritizing the fossil fuel elite and being on a kamikaze mission against clean energy.
Kamikaze mission, again, really strong language suggesting the policies are ultimately self-destructive.
Canceling energy and water standards for appliances was framed as saving corporations money at the expense of clean air, consumer savings, and the climate.
Right, hitting multiple points. Environment, consumer cost, corporate benefit.
This whole approach was labeled the Trump deregulation doctrine. Repeal savings, gut health protections, cancel emissions curbs, sabotage anything helping people, a regulatory revenge tour.
A very comprehensive and damning summary from that perspective. Revenge tour implies it's driven by politics more than policy rationale.
And they highlighted the disproportionate impact on frontline, poor, and minority communities already hit hardest by pollution.
Adding that environmental justice angle, which is increasingly central to these debates.
Finally, they pledged to fight these policies in court in the states, in the Senate. Clearly a major battleground.
Absolutely, a full-throated opposition laid out there.
Okay, shifting to something maybe a bit more mundane, but still part of the record. Senate rules. Mr. McConnell presented updated regulations for the Senate health and fitness facilities, and also for hallways and balconies.
The internal workings. Got to keep the place running smoothly.
Yeah, details on who can use the gym, fees, reservations, how to display flags using the balconies. It's a peek behind the curtain at the Senate's own housekeeping.
Important for the institution, even if it doesn't make headlines, shows the level of detail needed to manage the place.
The record also included commemorations. Mr. Kane recognized National Salvation Army Week, praising their long history and massive reach, helping over 27 million Americans annually.
A well-deserved recognition for a major service organization.
Mrs. Height-Smith acknowledged National Police Week again, honoring fallen officers nationally, and specifically 4 from Mississippi whose names were added to the National Memorial. She shared details about them and their families.
Very poignant. These personal tributes are an important function of the Senate.
And Mr. McConnell honored Kentucky State Senator Danny Carroll, who is retiring as head of Easter Seals West Kentucky, noting his long service in law enforcement before that.
Recognizing contributions across different fields, public service, community leadership.
All right, let's look at the legislative business and calendar section. Messages from the president, communications from agencies referred to committees, standard stuff.
The daily flow of information.
Several new bills introduced. S-1708 on agency rulemaking, S-1709 on nurse-to-patient staffing ratios.
That's a perennial issue in healthcare.
S-1710 on family leave for military families, S-1711 about prohibiting federal funds for certain foreign vehicles, a mix of things.
Shows the breadth of issues senators are working on.
Also some resolutions supporting Veterans Affairs Research Week, commending public servants during Public Service Recognition Week.
Symbolic but important acknowledgments.
And we see co-sponsors being added to existing bills, plus statements explaining new bills, like the one on nurse staffing.
Yeah, that's the process. Introducing bills, building support, making the case publicly.
But then something potentially quite explosive. Senate Resolution 217 was submitted,
Ooh, what was that?
expressing a formal lack of confidence in the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy, Jr.
Wow. A no-confidence resolution in a cabinet secretary. That's serious.
It detailed a long list of alleged failures undermining research, cutting funding, mass firings, spreading misinformation, especially on vaccines and autism.
Okay, that's a major development. A comprehensive indictment laid out in a formal Senate resolution. It signals deep trouble and significant opposition to the HHS secretary within the Senate itself. Definitely something to watch. And looking ahead, the Senate adjourned till the next morning. The schedule included more work on the Rubenstein nomination, votes on him, plus cloture votes for Air Force Secretary nominee Mink and Deputy Energy Secretary nominee Danley.
So the nomination battles continue.
Plus, committee meetings scheduled all week on agriculture, appropriations, armed services, commerce, foreign relations, health, judiciary, the list goes on.
The engine keeps running, lots of work happening in committees, even alongside the floor action.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together. What does this one day in the Congressional Record really tell you, the listener?
Well, you clearly see a Congress wrestling with big, contentious issues, right? Healthcare funding, energy policy, deep disagreements there.
Absolutely. You see the push and pull, the different priorities, and the use of procedure like cloture as a tool, either to move things along or to block them.
And the rhetoric,
Mhm.
pretty passionate, highlighting those deep divides. But you also see the other side, the Senate taking time for tributes, acknowledging service and loss.
And those detailed regulations, they give you a little window into just how the institution itself runs day to day.
And that no-confidence resolution against the HHS secretary that really underscores the intense political environment right now.
So keeping track of these debates, the votes, the procedures, it's all crucial if you want to understand where policy is headed and how it might affect you. We hope this deep dive kind of peeled back some layers for you.
Did anything particularly stand out to you from this day? What questions pop into your head about how Congress works or about these specific policies?
Because this is just one day, right? It's a snapshot. It really encourages you to maybe look deeper into what your own elected officials are doing, the issues you care about.
And remember, the Congressional Record itself, it's a primary source. It's the official account, maybe a bit formal, but it's direct. Reading it, or summaries like this, gives you a less filtered view of the arguments, the priorities, the dynamics.
It's a powerful tool for staying informed, definitely.
Absolutely, being an informed citizen.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us on Congress in Context.
We'll be back soon to explore another aspect of policy and governance.